Hello, this is Ketchi1383 with Ketchi Gaming, and this is part 2 of my Grounded series. So, there's some things that came to my attention that I didn't even notice. I mean, I did, but I didn't think of it at the time, and that the aspect ratio of my videos was recorded in, it was like 16 by 900 for some odd reason. It's set up to record my screen, but for whatever reason, Grounded kept changing my aspect ratio from 1920 by the 1080 to that 16:900 or whatever it is. So that's why I have those weird black boxes, and unfortunately going back and recording more footage would just take way more time. So I'm just going to roll with it, kind of like when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade kind of deals. And then I accidentally published the rough draft version of my part 1, where I would go back, listen, and make changes as I go, instead of the revised part 1 after I listened. So I'm just going to leave that, roll with the punches as well in terms of part 1. Hopefully I'll do better in part 2. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. So the crafting menu isn't anything particularly complicated. It's pretty basic. It's nothing like Sons of the Forest or The Forest, where you have everything just laid out on a tarp and it's just a huge mess to look at, which is part of the presentation, but this simplifies everything. And I suspect that's because it's probably geared to a younger audience, not somebody who's clearly in their late 30s like me. But it does make things kind of nice and simple, telling you what you need and even telling you if you have enough of what you need, and allowing you to click on what you're missing to see if you have materials to make it or if it's just a basic raw material. Simple and easy. So after getting the crafting down and making some tools, you go to this device that it more or less points you to, and you try and activate it, and you see that some of the lasers aren't working, so you go and set off to try and get those to work. Now, depending on your knowledge of the game, you also might just be really fast and get to that point within the first day. I pretty much did. I actually kind of had to mess around to get it to go to nighttime. But there's other aspects to this game, such as eating and drinking in order to stay alive, with consequences to not eating or drinking enough, potentially leading to death, even at one point where you have a 30-second countdown to actually drink something or eat something before you die. And if you don't eat enough, your stamina meter will only fill halfway, which has some consequences in terms of being able to sprint, and even in terms of being able to fight the more hostile insects in the game. Now, unfortunately, in terms of the actual survival, fending off the various insects is about as far as it goes in terms of not dying, along with staving off thirst and hunger. There's no temperature to speak of. There sort of is to some degree in terms of extreme heat they call sizzle, which only happens in the sandbox or close to the barbecue. But other than that, there's no cold weather or anything like that. And the sizzling really isn't that much of an issue, especially if you have the right gear. And it's pretty much the only time they involve any form of temperature in order to avoid from being killed by the elements. It's rather basic in that regards. And again, it's probably a very intentional to keep it simple for a younger audience. So once they get you settled in and you figure out how to get these lasers to function again, you go to this device called a spacer and you activate it, but something goes terribly wrong and it doesn't quite function the way it's supposed to, causing a bit of an explosion that they show you out by an oak tree in the yard, indicating that's where you're supposed to go next. Now, there's one thing I should mention is it follows a bit of a, I guess, trope at this point in time in terms of sort of its story that they're telling, in that some of the, I guess, plot is told through Dr. Wendell, the man who invented the spacer, the device that shrinks you down and increases your size. In this case, he shrunk himself down and he's been living in the backyard. And that's what your first tape that you find lets you know. But as you progress, you find all these other tapes through the various labs that you go through. And it explains specific situations of what he was doing in each lab. And it tells backstories of what happened at each lab and why each of them's probably destroyed and abandoned. But in terms of Dr. Wendell overall, he's kind of an idiot savant, a brilliant dipshit. I don't know how else to put it. Through, I guess, a series of him just being incompetent has led to issues with his experiments while being small, such as not taking care of his yard properly, which led to certain insects kind of becoming a problem later on for him and for your characters. But not only that, you find out that he invents things that only sort of work or have no real practical use, and as a result he ends up losing his job with the company Ominent. I mean, if that doesn't scream evil corporation, I don't know what does. I mean, I touch on the cliche side that a evil corporation is behind everything, but it's really obvious right off the bat. What isn't obvious is actually how you get in the backyard, which I'll cover a little bit later. So anyways, after you hit that button and the spacer kind of causes an explosion at the oak tree, that's when the kid gloves come off. They sort of kept some of the more aggressive insects at bay at this point in time. And at this point, they now start to come out at night, making nighttime to be a bit of a dangerous time to be out and about. And when you're first starting out with just the grass weapons, they're not going to be suitable for handling the more dangerous insects out there. So going back to that crafting system, there is a clear progression in terms of what you can build based off of what insects you kill. As you kill the more difficult insects, the more equipment and better equipment you can build, allowing you to kill the more advanced insects. And it just kind of keeps going up until the end of the game. Except it kind of does hit a bit of a stopping point. And that it only goes up to 3 tiers, even though it feels like some of those third tiers are a bit of a 4th tier weapon in comparison to some of their fellow 3rd tier items. And in some cases, some of the things you need to make some of the items is a bit of an odd choice. So there's a gas mask in the game. And in order to make said gas mask, it requires you to use parts from a stink bug. Now, the ironic thing is the stink bug releases a toxic cloud of gas that kills you, and the hard counter to that is the gas mask. Seems kind of like a odd choice to make in terms of allowing the player to survive gas is using something against a insect that is extremely dangerous to you at the beginning of the game, which kind of leads me to a point I have in terms when you first start out. There are several insects when you first start the game that are a particular threat. For instance, the spiders in particular. You have the garden spiders right here, or they're actually called the orb weavers, but they look like garden spiders. And then you have the wolf spiders. They're particularly dangerous, and when you get past that initial sort of tutorial phase, they come out in droves, and they're extremely dangerous. And when I first started playing, I found myself kind of having to cheese a lot of the stronger enemies, such as the spiders or even the aforementioned stink bug, due to the nature of how dangerous they are. Granted, killing these insects allowed me to get better equipment to be able to take them on without having to resort to going up into high places. But I had to do this more often than I actually particularly cared for. And even after getting used to the combat system, when you're this low in level, some insects are just insurmountable until you kind of kill said insects to get those parts to be able to kill them. And it happened quite a bit when you first start out, particularly with the orb weavers and even more so with the wolf spiders. And in terms of the gameplay overall, it's a bit of a negative to have to kind of cheese all these enemies in order to progress through the game so that you don't have to cheese it, so to speak. But it happens again later on in the game. And when you first start out, nothing exemplifies that more than going to the oak after the explosion from the device that you attempted to fix by chopping down the grass and getting the mites to stop chewing on the cord. And that would be the wolf spiders that I just mentioned. But at this particular oak tree where you have to go to in order to progress through the game, for all intents and purposes, you find out one, not two, but three of some of the toughest enemies for the first third of the game. Every time I came across one of these wolf spiders, I either had to cheese it in order to kill it, or run away in hopes that they wouldn't kill me, which most of the time they could easily catch up to you. Now, there's far worse enemies when you get to the upper yard, making these wolf spiders look like chumps. And you'll also get weapons that make them even easier to kill. There was one level 2 weapon that sort of helped, but ironically, much like the stink bug, you needed parts from said spiders in order to make it. Outside of the fangs you need to make the dagger that will allow you to kill them, it's not really necessary to engage with them, but they do act as a bit of a barrier of entry to some places and keep you from exploring at night as they constantly roam about. Kind of acting as a hard barrier for beginning players or newer players. I should clarify that being players who are starting a new game versus players who have never played the game before. So at this point I wanted to show a bit of gameplay that I found really good in comparison to some other games, and that's with the arrows. I shot a ton of arrows at this spider, and you can pick them up, which is nothing new, but they highlight them so that you can find them, which you can easily lose arrows in this game just by missing something that you're shooting at, even on ground level. And it was actually a really nice feature for them to include. I mean, it's not just the arrows. It also highlights anything that you may have thrown, such as a spear, or if for whatever reason you threw, let's say, a sword, or you accidentally threw one of your tools, it will highlight it for you, which is really, really nice. Like I said, you may not want to depart with something you accidentally threw. Now, one of the neater things that they do in the game is insects can fight each other. And in this case, I actually got two of some of the hardest enemies to duke it out with each other while trying to go after me, making one easier to kill after it killed the other. And it was just a little neat sort of mechanic that, although it was purely on accident, yes, the insects can be tricked into fighting each other. So in order to find what an insect's weakness is, you have to do what they call peeping, where your character kind of holds their hands up like they're looking through binoculars, and this can tell you what kind of insect you're dealing with and what its weaknesses are. You saw me do it already with the ladybug and the wolf spider. So continuing on with the story, you go to where the explosion happened on the back of the oak tree, and you find a lab where you find a robot named Burgle. Burgle is exceptionally annoying, and you have to interact with him multiple times due to him having the ingredients stored in chips that you have to find throughout the yard in various labs, and each chip contains a portion of the recipe for the serum that allows you to get bigger. He then directs you to the various labs that are located throughout the yard. One being in the black anthill versus the red anthill, one being in the fungal infested part of the yard, one being in the hedge that's infested with spiders, including a brood mother, but you have to find a special recipe to summon her, and one located in a pond with a koi fish in it. And at that size, or at least the size of the player, that fish is much bigger than even just a shark. It is a whale that will hunt you down and will kill you. On top of that, you'll find more cassettes, similar to that of BioShock, where you find out what happened with that particular lab and what he's working on, as well as sort of events that caused him to be fired and set up his labs in the various parts of the yard. On top of that, he then opens up a ASL terminal, which allows you to access recipes and allows you to build even more things, particularly bases at this point in time, which you'll need because there's a lot of things you have to make in order to make other items to more or less increase your ability to deal with the insects that are coming your way or that you have to deal with.